Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be taking a look at camera solve techniques.
Mm,
You specifically wanted to know how it's used and how it actually works.
hmm
And the footage you sent over is a Door 19 School YouTube tutorial,
Right.
which is kind of cool because we're actually going to be looking at a practical walkthrough of this.
Yeah.
And they use Fusion software, I believe.
hmm
So are you ready to decode this?
Absolutely. It's kind of like digital detective work in a way.
Okay.
We're trying to figure out how a camera moved in 3D space so we can add things seamlessly.
So the footage that they're using in this tutorial, it's
Yeah.
like of a hallway.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to be adding the Door 19 logo.
Uh-huh.
And get this, a whole barrel into the scene.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing what you can do with video editing these days.
Oh, yeah.
So where do we even begin with this? What's the first step?
Well, it all starts with camera tracking. Think of it as like teaching the software to see the scene like the camera did.
Right, but how do you teach software to see?
Well, this tutorial uses a tool in Fusion called the camera tracker, and it's all about identifying trackable points in the footage. It could be corners, edges, any kind of distinct pattern, really, anything that stands out visually.
So you're basically telling the software, hey, pay attention to how these points move.
Exactly. And the software analyzes how these points shift from frame to frame. It's literally calculating the camera's position, its rotation in 3D space. It's reconstructing the camera's path through the scene.
Wow. Now, something I noticed in the tutorial is that they really hammered on the solve and error values.
Right.
What are those? Is that kind of how we're measuring how well the software is seeing the scene?
You got it. Solve basically tells you how successfully the software has been able to map the camera's movement. A high solve means a more accurate track.
Okay.
An error is, it's kind of like wiggle room. It's the deviation from the actual camera path.
Oh, okay.
We want a low error, obviously.
Right, so low error means high precision.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay, so let's say the solve is low and the error is high. What's going to happen to my 3D objects? Are they going to look all wonky and floating around instead of staying put in the scene?
Precisely. A poor solve would make those 3D additions look really out of place. They wouldn't move naturally with the camera, and it would break the illusion.
Okay, so now we've got the software,
Yeah.
tracking every move of this camera.
Right.
Then what? How does it know where to put the 3D objects?
Well, that's where building a virtual world comes in. The software uses that tracking data to create a 3D replica of the environment that was filmed. So like a digital twin of that hallway.
Oh, okay, so it's like a virtual set built on top of that footage.
Exactly.
And that's where the 3D objects get added in.
Precisely. Once you have that virtual environment, you can then import and position 3D models that will interact realistically with the scene. Because, of course, they're following the same camera movements.
Okay, now this is where things start to get kind of tricky for me. I mean, I understand, sticking the Door 19 logo on a flat wall, that seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah,
But the tutorial puts a barrel behind a wall.
right.
How do you make something look like it's behind something else when it's all digital?
That's where masking comes in. It's a technique that lets you selectively hide portions of a 3D object. It's like using a stencil to block off areas you don't want to paint.
Oh, so they create a digital stencil shaped like the wall, and then they just kind of place it over the barrel. So it looks like that wall is actually blocking part of the barrel.
Exactly. And because you have that camera track, the mask moves perfectly with the footage.
Oh, cool.
So the illusion remains convincing.
I can only imagine how many moving parts have to be in sync for this to actually work.
Oh, it's a lot.
Now, in the tutorial, they also added motion blur to the logo.
Right.
Why is that important for realism?
Well, our brains are wired to expect a little bit of blur when things are moving, right? In the
Yeah.
real world, moving cameras capture that blur naturally. So by adding motion blur to that logo, we're mimicking that effect, and it helps the 3D element blend seamlessly with the footage.
So it's not just about making things look cool. It's about
Mm.
aligning it with our expectations of how the world visually works.
Precisely. It's all about tricking the eye into believing that those 3D elements were always part of that scene. It makes it much harder for viewers to distinguish what's real and what's added.
Wow. Okay, so we've tracked the camera. We've built our virtual world.
Right.
We've figured out how to mask and add blur. What else is crucial for creating this believable illusion?
Well, one really important consideration is how light and shadow play a role in the overall scene.
Okay.
And that's where we start to delve into the nuances of making those 3D elements truly convincing.
So that has something to do with how the lighting in the original footage is affecting those 3D additions.
Exactly. If we want that Door 19 logo to look like it was always part of that wall, we need to make sure it's being lit by the same light sources that were illuminating that hallway when it was filmed.
So it's almost like you have to analyze that original scene and then recreate those lighting conditions in that digital replica.
Absolutely. It's a meticulous process, but it's really crucial for achieving that realistic look.
It's really blowing my mind how much work goes into making these like seemingly simple visual effects. It's like this whole hidden world of detail and precision.
It is.
So what's next in the Door 19 school tutorial?
Well, they actually go into some pretty clever techniques for positioning the 3D elements. It's fascinating how they make sure everything is aligned perfectly. Shall we dive into that next?
Let's do it. This is already so much deeper than I expected.
Yeah. So let's see how they actually place these 3D elements within the scene.
Yeah, I'm really curious about this part. I mean, they've tracked the camera, they've built this virtual hallway.
Right.
But how do they make sure everything lines up perfectly?
Yeah.
Especially with that barrel, like being partially hidden behind the wall.
Yeah, it's like a virtual jigsaw puzzle. And the first piece is establishing a reference point.
Okay.
They call it the origin. And it's essentially the anchor for positioning everything else.
So it's like marking a spot on a map and saying, this is where we start.
Exactly. They choose a specific point in the real-world footage that corresponds to a location in their 3D environment. And that ensures that when they bring in those 3D models, they're placed correctly relative to the real-world scene.
I'm guessing precision is key here, right?
Oh, yeah.
Even a tiny misalignment could, like, throw everything off?
Absolutely. It'd be like building a house on a foundation that's slightly tilted. The whole structure would be off.
Oh, yeah.
And in the tutorial, they use the set origin command in Fusion to establish that anchor point.
Okay, so we've got our anchor point, our origin. What's next? How do they actually bring in, like, the 3D models of the logo and the barrel?
Well, they import them as separate elements. The Door 19 logo is treated like a flat image, whereas the barrel is a full 3D model.
Okay.
And this is where we see the flexibility of Camera Resolve, because you can actually work with different types of 3D assets.
Right, because the logo is basically just a shape, but that barrel has, like, volume and depth.
Exactly.
So that adds another layer of complexity.
It does. And once they have those elements imported, they connect them to something called a Merge 3D node in Fusion.
Okay, what's going on in that Merge 3D node? That sounds like where the real magic happens.
You got it. This is where everything comes together. That Merge 3D node takes the 3D models, the camera tracking data, and the original footage, and it combines them into a single composite. It's what allows those 3D objects to interact with the real-world footage, moving and scaling based on the camera's perspective.
So it's not just like pasting a 3D object onto a flat video.
No.
It's about integrating it into the scene so it behaves like a real object in that space.
Exactly. If you just slap the 3D barrel on top of the video, it would look totally out of place.
Yeah.
The Merge 3D node is what makes it move and react to the camera's movements as if it were physically present in the scene.
I can see why they call it Merge 3D. It's like merging those two worlds together.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where that masking technique we talked about earlier comes in, especially for the barrel.
Right, because part of that barrel is supposed to be behind the wall.
Right.
So they're using that digital stencil to only show the parts of the barrel that should be visible.
Exactly. And because they have that precise camera tracking data, that mask moves perfectly along with the footage.
Uh-huh.
So it maintains that illusion of the barrel being partially obscured by the wall.
It's amazing how all these pieces fit together to create such a convincing effect. So they've got the placement, the masking.
Right.
What else do they focus on in the tutorial?
Well, they actually go into the importance of adding shadows to the 3D elements, which is another really crucial step in making them look grounded in the scene.
Right, because in the real world, objects cast shadows.
Right.
And those shadows kind of tell us a lot about the lighting and the environment.
Exactly. If that Door 19 logo was just floating on the wall with no shadow, it would look totally fake.
Yeah.
The shadow is what helps integrate it into the scene, making it appear as if it's actually interacting with the light sources in that hallway.
So how do they even create those shadows? Do they have to, like, manually paint them in or something?
No, not at all. The 3D software actually calculates the shadows based on the virtual light sources that they've set up in the scene.
Oh, wow.
Remember how we talked about analyzing the lighting in the original footage and then recreating it in the digital world?
Yeah, it's like they're building a virtual sun to cast those shadows accurately.
Precisely. By matching the direction and intensity of the light in the real-world scene, they can generate shadows for the 3D objects that perfectly align with the lighting conditions,
Ah.
which further enhances the realism.
It's like a digital lighting crew setting up the perfect shot.
It is.
So they've got the placement, the masking, the shadows.
Right.
What else is on their checklist for making these 3D elements look convincing?
One final detail they highlight is adding motion blur to the Door 19 logo.
Okay.
It seems like a small thing, but it makes a big difference in how our brains perceive the scene.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
It's about aligning the visual experience with how we naturally perceive movement in the real world.
Exactly. Our brains are wired to expect a little bit of blur when things are moving quickly, especially when captured by a camera. So by adding that subtle motion blur to the logo, they're mimicking that real-world phenomenon. It basically tricks our eyes into believing that the logo is truly moving with the camera in that scene.
It's like they're adding that little bit of visual noise that our brains expect to see.
Yeah, exactly.
It's fascinating how much thought goes into making these effects look natural.
It is. It is. It's all about understanding how our visual perception works and then using that knowledge to create a more convincing and immersive experience.
So they've covered placement, masking, shadows, and motion blur. Seems like they've thought of everything.
They have.
What else is there to explore in this camera solve world?
Well, this Door 19 school tutorial focuses on Fusion software.
Right.
But are these techniques only possible in Fusion?
Oh, that's a good question.
What about other video editing or visual effects software?
Yeah, does this require specialized software, or are these, like, principles applicable in other programs?
That's something we can definitely delve into.
Okay.
Let's broaden our perspective and see how these camera solve principles translate across different platforms.
Okay, so we've gone through all the steps in camera solve, but is Fusion the only software that can do this? What about other programs?
Great question. This Door 19 school tutorial uses Fusion, but those underlying principles are the same across the board. Most video editing and visual effects software have tools for camera tracking and 3D integration.
So, like, if I was using After Effects, Blender, or something else, could I still use these concepts to get similar results?
Absolutely. It's like learning to drive. Once you get the basic steering, braking, acceleration, you can drive different kinds of cars.
Oh, okay, that's a good analogy.
Yeah.
So this Door 19 school example, they're using, like, a hallway, a logo, and a barrel.
Right.
But where do we see this camera solve technique being used in, like, real-world projects?
One of the biggest places is film and television, where, visual effects are huge.
Yeah. I mean, we see incredible things in movies, superheroes flying, epic battles, entire worlds created digitally. I can't imagine any of that being possible without camera solve.
Exactly. Camera solve is what lets them blend those computer-generated elements with live-action footage.
Oh, okay.
Makes it believable.
Like, I always think about those behind-the-scenes videos where you see the actors performing in front of a green screen.
Right.
Is that where the camera solve comes in to,
Okay.
like, replace the background?
Yeah, absolutely. They track the camera's movement during the green screen shoot, and then they can replace that green background with anything. A city, a different planet, you name it.
Wow, so you could literally put an actor in any world you want, all thanks to camera solve.
Pretty much. It gives filmmakers so many creative options, things that would be impossible or crazy expensive to do with just practical effects.
So film and TV, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Where else does camera solve show up?
It's actually starting to be used in architecture and real estate. Imagine taking blueprints and turning them into a 3D walkthrough of a building.
Oh, that's cool. So instead of just looking at flat drawings, you could virtually walk through a house before it's even built.
Exactly. It helps clients really see what the finished product will be like, way better than just looking at plans.
That's like taking a test drive, but for a house.
Yeah, kinda.
Are there any uses in education or even scientific research?
Definitely. Think about interactive 3D models. With Camera Solve, students could explore the Colosseum in virtual reality, examine ancient pottery, even walk inside a dinosaur skeleton.
Wow. It's like making those textbook lessons come to life.
Exactly. And in research, it can help visualize complex data or make 3D simulations of scientific phenomena.
So this is more than just fancy visuals for entertainment. It's a powerful tool across many fields.
Absolutely. It helps connect the real and the virtual, making information easier to understand and more engaging.
This deep dive really opened my eyes to how important camera solve is. It's incredible how it's become such a big part of how we see and understand the world.
Totally agree. And as technology keeps getting better, who knows what we'll be able to do with it.
Well, that's it for a deep dive today. Keep exploring, and we'll catch you next time.